Welcome back to Spotlight Murders by Skoob. I'm your host, Kieran Caldwell. And today, we're taking a drive into the dark, twisted heart of a crime that brought Hollywood to its knees. This isn't just a murder story, it's a seismic, cultural shockwave, one that marked the moment the dream of the 1960s curdled into something far more sinister. It's about power, manipulation, and a man whose twisted charisma turned peace-loving followers into killers. Her name was Sharon Tate, an actress on the rise, 8 months pregnant, surrounded by friends in her Los Angeles home. What should have been a quiet summer night became a scene of almost unimaginable horror. And behind it all, a cult led by a failed musician with a god complex, Charles Manson. What you're about to hear isn't just a retelling of a crime. It's a descent into the chaos that lurks behind celebrity, the illusion of safety, and the fine line between counterculture and cult control. It's about how a few words, spoken by the wrong person at the right moment, can spark a massacre. We'll trace the path from Spawn Ranch to Cielo Drive, from peace signs and LSD to butcher knives and Helter Skelter. This is the story of how a group of young people, most of them barely out of their teens, became the instruments of a slaughter that would horrify the world and end an era. This is the Tate murders, and they weren't just a crime, they were a turning point. Stay with us, because in Hollywood, sometimes the scariest monsters aren't on screen, they're already inside the gates. Let me paint you a picture of who these people were, because this wasn't just a random crime. These were real people with real dreams, real lives, real futures that were brutally cut short. Sharon Tate was just 26 years old, 8 months pregnant, and on the cusp of stardom. She'd worked her way up from bit roles in shows like Mr. Ed and The Man from UNCLE to breakout performances in films like The Fearless Vampire Killers and Valley of the Dolls, a role that earned her a Golden Globe nomination. She was married to Roman Polanski, the acclaimed director who was in Europe at the time, finishing a screenplay called The Day of the Dolphin. He'd promised to return in just a few days. With Sharon that night were 3 close friends, Jay Sebring, a celebrated Hollywood hairstylist, and Sharon's former lover, who had remained a dear friend. Abigail Folger, called Gibby by her friends, was a social worker and heiress to the Folger coffee fortune. She was there with her boyfriend, Wojciech Frykowski, a Polish actor trying to make it in Hollywood. They'd just returned from dinner. It was a peaceful evening, the kind of quiet night at home that pregnant women cherish. Sharon often liked having company when Roman was away. They were winding down, having quiet conversations, enjoying each other's company. Abigail was reading a book. Wojciech had fallen asleep on the living room couch. None of them could have imagined that their peaceful evening would soon become the stuff of nightmares. August 10th, 1969. The headlines screamed across every newspaper in America. Bizarre murders rock Hollywood. The world woke up to news that defied comprehension. 4 people, and Sharon's unborn child, had been found dead in a blood-soaked scene that authorities could only describe as ritualistic slaughter. The Los Angeles Police Department had seen a lot, but nothing like this. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. Nothing had been stolen. This wasn't a crime of passion. There was too much organization, too much deliberate cruelty. The scene bore marks of what could only be described as ceremonial killing. The media went into overdrive. Wild theories began swirling immediately. Some speculated the murders were drug-related. Others feared connections to gambling rings. The most terrifying theory of all? A satanic or cultish element. The word pig had been written in Sharon's blood on the front door, a message that chilled investigators to the bone. Within days, a second killing occurred in Los Feliz. Was it connected? Was there a serial killer loose in Los Angeles? The city was gripped by paranoia. Hollywood's golden bubble had been burst, and suddenly, nowhere felt safe. For months, the LAPD chased ghosts. On August 11th, a 19-year-old youth from Lancaster emerged as a suspect, but the arrest led nowhere. The investigation was like trying to catch smoke with bare hands. Weather reports from that weekend noted the oppressive conditions, hot, smoggy, tense, as if the very atmosphere reflected the city's anguish. On August 14th, funeral services were held for Sharon, Jay, Abigail, and Wojciech. Hollywood elites filled the chapel, but the question that haunted everyone remained: who could have committed such savage acts? By mid-August, investigators turned their attention to the drug underworld. Substances had reportedly been found at the crime scene, fueling theories that the victims were targeted due to narcotics. But this narrative began to unravel almost immediately. An informant came forward on August 16th, alleging that 3 individuals were tied to the killings and that drugs were central to the case. Yet police still lacked conclusive evidence. Hundreds were questioned. Canadian acquaintances, ex-fiancés of celebrities, anyone with even the most tenuous connection to the victims. By early September, after interviewing over 300 people, authorities had to make a humiliating admission. They were no closer to a solid lead than they'd been on day 1. The autopsy report from coroner Thomas Noguchi confirmed everyone's worst fears. This was no isolated act of violence, but a coordinated attack involving at least 2 or 3 assailants working together. Speculation ran rampant in the press. Rewards were offered. Eyewitness reports were inconsistent and confusing. Then, in October, a new clue emerged that would reignite the investigation. A pair of eyeglasses discovered at the murder site. It was small, but it was something. A thread to pull in a case that had grown frustratingly cold. December 2nd, 1969. 4 months after the murders, law enforcement made an announcement that stunned the world. The killers hadn't been professional criminals or drug dealers or even traditional cultists. They were something far more disturbing, a strange nomadic band led by a manipulative, self-styled spiritual guru named Charles Manson. The media immediately branded them a savage mystic cult, and for good reason. This wasn't just a group of criminals. This was a twisted family that had fused hallucinogenic drug use with apocalyptic visions and prophecies of racial war. They'd been living on the fringes of society at an old movie ranch called Spawn Ranch, hidden away from civilization, brewing their poisonous ideology. When Manson and his followers were arrested, the details that emerged painted a picture more horrifying than any crime thriller. According to former disciples who came forward, the murders weren't random acts of violence. They were part of a larger, more sinister scheme to incite chaos and civil unrest across America. Manson, it was revealed, was obsessed with something he called Helter, Skelter, inspired by the Beatles song. He believed these killings would help trigger a race war that would tear the country apart. In his twisted mind, the Tate murders were just the opening move in a game of apocalyptic chess. But here's where the story gets even more chilling. The attack on 10,050 Cielo Drive wasn't as random as it initially appeared. Months before the murders, Charles Manson had actually visited the house, not once, but twice. A photographer named Hatami lived on the property and encountered a strange man trespassing in his yard. It was sometime in the afternoon, the day before Sharon Tate left for Europe. Hatami described the intruder as a short man, roughly the same height as Roman Polanski in his late 20s, skinny, with long, dark brown hair. He was clean-shaven but looked like he needed a shave. The man claimed to be searching for someone, possibly mentioning the name Melcher. This was significant because Terry Melcher, Doris Day's son and a record producer, had previously lived at the address. Manson had been trying to get a recording contract and had visited Melcher at the house a year earlier, only to be rejected. Hatami, protective of Sharon while Roman was away, raised his voice at the intruder. The man appeared upset by this confrontation, turned and left without saying a word. But here's the terrifying part. Sharon Tate had appeared at the door during this interaction. There was no doubt about it. Charles Manson had seen Sharon Tate, and she had seen him. She had looked directly into the eyes of the man who would later orchestrate her murder. Later, Hatami would identify a photograph of Charles Manson as the trespasser, though he wasn't completely certain at first. Only toward the end of police discussions did he realize that the man he had confronted might have been the one accused of orchestrating Sharon Tate's murder. This sequence of events only came to light because investigators suspected that Terry Melcher was withholding information. Without that suspicion, Manson might never have been placed at the scene before the murders occurred. Now comes the hardest part of our story, but it's crucial to understand exactly what happened that night, because the level of calculated cruelty reveals the true nature of what we're dealing with. Around midnight on August 8, 1969, 4 figures crept onto the property at 10,050 Cielo Drive. Charles Tex Watson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Linda Kasabian moved through the darkness like predators. They scouted the grounds until they found an unlocked window at the front of the house. Watson silently cut the screen and slipped inside, followed by Atkins and Krenwinkel. Kasabian remained outside as a lookout, a decision that would later prove crucial when she became the prosecution's star witness. Inside, Wojciech Frykowski lay sleeping on the living room couch. Watson pressed the barrel of a revolver to his face, waking him with words that would haunt America forever.
"I am the devil, and I'm here to do the devil's business."
Think about that for a moment. This wasn't a robbery. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was theater, dark, twisted theater designed to terrorize. Frykowski was bound using towels. While Atkins was retrieving them, she heard voices from the back rooms. Sharon, Jay, and Abigail were still awake. When Atkins saw Abigail reading her book, she casually waved. Abigail, used to visitors at odd hours in the Hollywood lifestyle, simply waved back and returned to her reading. She had no idea she was greeting one of her killers. Watson ordered the other victims to be brought into the living room. Using knives as threats, they herded Sharon, Jay, and Abigail together with Wojciech. Watson tied Jay Sebring's hands and looped a rope around his neck, then threaded the other end around Sharon's neck, binding their fates literally and symbolically. When Jay protested the cruel treatment of the visibly pregnant Sharon, Watson's response was swift and merciless. He shot Jay in the chest, then stabbed him repeatedly, leaving him to bleed out on the carpet. This was just the beginning. What happened next defies human comprehension. Wojciech Frykowski, despite being bound and beaten, attempted to resist. Watson beat him so savagely with his gun that the weapon's grip broke. Then Atkins and Krenwinkel joined in, stabbing him multiple times. Even as he staggered toward the door in a desperate attempt to escape, they pursued him and cut him down on the lawn outside. Abigail Folger broke free during the chaos and sprinted toward the pool area, fighting for her life with every step. Watson pursued her like a hunter chasing prey, ultimately catching and stabbing her to death. The living room had become a slaughterhouse. Sharon Tate, 8.5 months pregnant, had witnessed her friend's violent deaths. She was held down by Atkins and Krenwinkel, and in her final moments, she begged, not for her own life, but for the life of her unborn child. Her pleas were ignored. Susan Atkins stabbed Sharon at least 16 times. Afterward, in an act of unimaginable cruelty, they tied Sharon's lifeless body to Jay's, using the same rope, creating a grotesque tableau that would haunt crime scene investigators forever. Before leaving, Atkins smeared the word PIG in Sharon's blood on the front door. Watson, showing no emotion whatsoever, kicked the bodies before departing. They drove back to Spawn Ranch, changed out of their bloodied clothing, and dumped their weapons in the Hollywood Hills as if they'd just finished any other job. When Manson later discovered that the group had left fingerprints and that Atkins had lost her knife, he returned to the scene with another follower to clean up. Upon seeing the carnage his orders had created, Manson was reportedly unmoved, as if the deaths of 5 people, including an unborn child, were simply the cost of doing business in his twisted revolution. The full horror of what happened that night might never have come to light if not for the loose tongue of Susan Atkins, who went by the nickname Sadie within the Manson family. While in jail, she confided in a fellow inmate named Virginia Graham, and what she revealed was even more disturbing than the crime itself. Virginia Graham was initially shocked, exclaiming, "You're joking," when Sadie first hinted at her involvement. But Sadie simply smiled and shook her head. Their conversation lasted somewhere between 35 minutes to an hour, possibly longer, and Virginia found the details indelibly etched in her memory. When Virginia asked the obvious question, "Why did you do it, Sadie?" the answer was chillingly calculated. "We wanted to commit a crime so shocking that the world would have no choice but to take notice." But here's the most terrifying part. When asked why they chose the Tate house specifically, Susan's answer revealed the random nature of their evil. It's isolated. The house had been chosen not because of who lived there, but because of where it was located. They had some acquaintance with former resident Terry Melcher from a year earlier, but they had no idea who would be present that night, and it didn't matter to them. They were prepared to kill anyone they found. "So, you didn't know Jay Sebring or any of the other victims?" Virginia asked. "No," Susan replied without hesitation. "This wasn't personal. This wasn't revenge. This was random violence designed to terrorize society, which makes it infinitely more frightening." Susan explained that before leaving the ranch, Charlie had given them specific instructions. They wore dark clothes and carried changes of clothes in the car. The plan was methodical, calculated. 4 people had participated: Susan, 2 other girls, and a man, later identified as Charles Tex Watson. They had driven up to the gate, then back down to park at the bottom of the hill, walking back up to avoid detection. The man cut the telephone wires with practiced precision. Virginia got the impression he'd been to the house before, which we now know was true. While the killers were being hunted and eventually caught, there was another victim of this crime whose suffering played out in public view: Roman Polanski. On August 16th, 8 days after his wife's murder, Roman was interviewed by the LAPD for several hours. The following day, he visited 10,050 Cielo Drive for the first time since the horrific events. The scene that greeted him was beyond devastating. Accompanied by a writer and photographer from Life magazine, plus Peter Hurkos, a psychic hired by Jay Sebring's friends, Roman approached the house that had once been his sanctuary. As he identified himself and drove through the gate, still guarded by LAPD, he made a sardonic comment to his friend Thomas Thompson. This must be the world-famous orgy house, a bitter reference to the sensationalized media coverage. The blue bedsheet that had once covered Abigail Folger's body still lay on the lawn. The bloody lettering on the door had faded but remained legible, a grim reminder of the hatred that had been unleashed in his home. Inside, the destruction shocked him. The dark stains in the entryway, the larger ones in front of the couch. These weren't just crime scene markers. They were the places where his friends had died, where his wife had taken her last breath. He climbed the ladder to the loft and found a videotape that had been returned by the police, pocketing it as a memento of his former life. He walked around touching things, as if trying to summon the past, to make sense of the senseless. He pointed out the bed where Sharon had slept, its pillows still bunched up in the middle. "They were always that way when I was gone," he said, his voice breaking. "She hugged them instead of me." Perhaps most heartbreaking of all, he spent a long time by the wardrobe, where Sharon had stored items for their expected baby, tiny clothes and blankets for a child who would never come home. As Roman examined the now distorted familiar objects of his life, he kept asking the question that haunted everyone. Why? He was photographed, looking disoriented and lost at the front door, as if he had stepped into one of his own surreal film sets, only to find everything irreversibly and grotesquely altered. The psychic, Peter Hurkos, later told the media that Sharon Tate and the other victims were killed by 3 men whom he claimed to have identified to police. He described them as friends of Sharon turned murderers due to large doses of LSD, and warned they would kill again if not caught. He claimed the killings occurred during a black magic ritual called Guna Guna. Whether Hercos actually provided useful information to police is doubtful. Law enforcement typically treats such claims with skepticism, listening politely before disregarding them as inadmissible evidence. Roman himself was doubtful of the psychic's explanation, but the real explanation, when it finally emerged, was far more disturbing than any supernatural theory. The Sharon Tate murders weren't the work of Satan worshippers or drug-crazed hippies gone wrong. They were the calculated actions of a manipulative criminal who had created his own twisted family and convinced them that mass murder was their path to starting a revolution. By the end of December 1969, as Charles Manson appeared in court in chains, addressing the judge with defiant confidence, the full scope of the horror became clear. This wasn't just about 5 people who died on August 9th, 1969. This was about the death of an era, the violent end of the 1960s promise of peace and love, revealing the dark extremes to which disillusionment and fanaticism could lead. The Sharon Tate murders didn't just claim 5 lives that night in Benedict Canyon. They shattered America's innocence, proving that evil could strike anywhere, anytime, for no reason at all, except the twisted pleasure of watching the world burn. The case that began with 4 friends spending a quiet evening together ended with the realization that we live in a world where such evil can exist, can flourish, and can strike without warning. It's a lesson America learned in the summer of 1969, written in blood on the door of 10,050 Cielo Drive, that we carry with us still. That's our deep dive into the Tate murders, a crime that didn't just take lives, but shattered illusions. On the surface, it was about a cult, a madman, and a horrific night in the Hollywood Hills. But underneath, it was about something far more insidious. This wasn't just the end of the summer of love. It was the moment America realized that peace signs could be painted in blood, and that charisma, when twisted by power and ego, can become a weapon more dangerous than any knife. Charles Manson didn't kill anyone with his own hands, but he didn't have to. He used fear, control, and a warped vision of rebellion to turn young people into murderers. And in doing so, he exposed the cracks in a culture already teetering on the edge, where fame, freedom, and identity could all be manipulated by someone who claimed to have the answers. The Tate murders weren't just a tragedy. They were a wake-up call, a moment when Hollywood lost its innocence, and America lost its faith in the idea that evil would always wear a mask. Sometimes it smiles, sometimes it sings Beatles lyrics, and sometimes it looks just like the kid next door. To hear more about how the Manson family rose to power and the ongoing cultural obsession with the crimes they committed, head to the Skoob app for the extended episode. You'll get access to rare interviews, deep dive analysis, and a look at how the shadow of Cielo Drive still haunts our collective imagination. Download Skoob today on the App Store or Play Store. I'm your host, Kieran Caldwell. Thanks for walking with me through one of the darkest chapters in Hollywood history. And remember, in the land of sunshine and dreams, it's the shadows you should be afraid of.